Hi, this is Jeff Jacob, pastor at Loretto United Methodist Church. Today is Good Friday, and as a meditation, we are going to rehearse the Stations of the Cross, and we're using Stations of the Cross coloring pages that our church has colored during the season of Lent. The Stations of the Cross coloring posters and pages were created by artist Adam Walker Cleveland and were originally launched by Illustrated Children's Ministry in 2017. Given that the Illustrated Children's Ministry community comes from over 60 different denominations around the world, some of whom may not be familiar with the Stations of the Cross, they decided to create illustrations based on the 14 scriptural Stations of the Cross, which Pope John Paul II introduced on Good Friday in 1991. To guide our meditation, I'll be reading from the devotion companion that goes with the Stations of the Cross coloring pages. There's an old legend that says, after the death and resurrection of Jesus, his mother Mary would often walk the way her son had walked on his journey to the cross, pausing here and there to recall something that had happened at that spot. From these walks grew the early Christian practice of walking the Via Dolorosa, the way of the cross, in Jerusalem, a tradition that continues to this day. When they returned home, those early pilgrims to Jerusalem talked about their experiences, and soon many people began erecting stations of the cross on the walls and grounds of their own churches so worshipers could make the journey whenever they wished. The number of stations ranged from as few as 7 to as many as 30. Over time, however, the number became fixed at 14, including 5 stations depicting events that are not found in Scripture: the 3 falls of Jesus, the meeting with Mary, and the legend of Veronica's veil. On Good Friday 1991, Pope John Paul II introduced the 14 scriptural stations of the cross that many Christians now use. Catholic and Orthodox Christians were the first ones to use the stations in their devotional life. In recent years, Christians of many traditions have been rediscovering this ancient devotional practice. The story of Jesus' final hours, traditionally called the Passion, is the central story in each of the 4 Gospels. It is a story where all familiar with, yet each gospel writer tells it from a different perspective. Jesus' own journey to the cross did not take place down some sacred street. Rather, his journey is what made each step, each cobblestone, sacred and filled with the divine. At first glance, a large coloring poster might seem or might not seem like the most obvious place to meditate on these final hours of Jesus' life. But it is our hope that by coloring them and talking about them outside of our traditional sacred places, we can recognize that every place is an opportunity for an encounter with Christ along our own journey of faith. Let's go now to the Stations of the Cross, beginning with Station 1, called Sorrow. I will be reading from Matthew chapter 26, verses 36 through 41. So Jesus went with them to the place called Gethsemane. "You sit here," he said to the disciples, "while I go over there and pray." He took Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee with him and began to be very upset and distressed. "My soul is overwhelmed with grief," he said, "even to death. Stay here and keep watch with me." Then going a little further on, he fell on his face and prayed. "My Father," he said, "if it's possible, please let this cup go away from me. But not what I want, what you want." He came back to the disciples and found them asleep. So he said to Peter, "Couldn't you keep watch with me for a single hour? Watch and pray so that you don't get pulled down into the time of testing. The spirit is eager, but the body is weak." I want to say a couple of things. First of all, this station begins in the garden, and all of Scripture, the whole story of our faith begins in a garden. And at least for humanity, and there, the turning point was their disobedience. In the Garden of Gethsemane, we see Jesus fully yielding to his relationship with the Father, completely in tune with the Father, and we see complete obedience. Another turning point. Also, as we think about the name of this station called Sorrow, our nation is currently going through deep sorrow concerning the loss of life due to the coronavirus. Thousands have died. Thousands have lost loved ones. Many people have lost jobs, and most of us have been quarantined to homes and have had a period of time where we've been out of touch with relationships, so we feel great loss and sorrow because of that as well. So as we meditate upon this station, we think about that Jesus and the disciples are there in the Garden of Gethsemane, and Jesus in this moment of deepest sorrow is in great pain. But notice he's not alone. The scriptures say that Jesus went with the disciples. He then took his most trusted friends, Peter, James, and John, with him as he began the painful journey that would ultimately lead to new life. Although we tend to give them a bad rap for falling asleep 3 times, it's worth noting that at least they were present with Jesus in these moments in the garden. While most of us will not make history-altering decisions in our lifetimes, we all have moments of deep sorrow when we need to be surrounded by the love of our friends, especially those in the community of faith. Take a look at the picture before you. How many tears do you see? As you begin this journey to the cross with Jesus, remember that you're not alone. Remember also that as Psalm 30 verse 5 says, "At night we may cry, but when morning comes, we will celebrate." So as you reflect on Station 1, when have you faced a crisis and needed to turn to others for support or prayer? How did it make you feel to have to rely on them? Meditate on Station 1, sorrow. Now let's move to Station 2, called betrayal. It's where Jesus, betrayed by Judas, is arrested. We'll be reading from Mark chapter 14, verses 43 through 46. At once, while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived, and accompanied by a crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests, the legal experts, and the elders. The betrayer had given them a coded sign: "The one I kiss, that's him. Seize him and take him away safely." He came up to Jesus at once. "Rabbi," he said, and kissed him. The crowd laid hands on him and seized him. Someone once said that the saddest thing about betrayal is that it never comes from your enemies. And so it was with Jesus and Judas. The scriptures are quick to point out that Judas was one of the 12. It could even be argued that he was one of the more influential members of the inner circle. After all, he was the treasurer who made sure there was enough money to carry on the mission of building the kingdom. And yet it was this one of the 12 who betrayed Jesus, setting in motion events that would ultimately lead to Jesus' crucifixion. We will never know why Judas betrayed Jesus. Some people believe it was because he had no choice. It was all part of God's preordained plan. Others think it was because Judas was hungry for power and control of the group. Whatever his motives, his betrayal ultimately cost Jesus his life. Take a look at the picture before you. Close to the betrayer's lips is an object that looks oddly like a crescent moon. It's John's account of the Last Supper. After Judas gets up from the table to betray Jesus to the chief priests, John writes, "And it was night." When have you used your own position of trust to betray someone close to you? Have you ever been let down by a close friend or family member? How did you choose to deal with your feelings? Station 2, betrayal. As we approach Station 3, this one is named condemnation. Jesus is condemned by the Sanhedrin. I'll be reading from Luke chapter 22, verses 66 through 71. When the day broke, the official assembly of the people, the chief priests, and the scribes came together, and they took him off to their council. "If you are the Messiah," they said, "tell us." "If I tell you," he said to them, "you won't believe me, and if I ask you a question, you won't answer me. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of God's power." "So you are the Son of God, are you?" they said. "You say that I am," he said to them. "Why do we need any more witnesses?" they said. "We've heard it ourselves from his own mouth." As we arrive at this third station with Jesus, it is worth remembering that it was not evil people who condemned him. The people who passed false judgment were the good ones, the religious leaders, the ones who knew the law. Yet in one of the saddest mockeries of justice in history, they sentenced Jesus to death, but not before they asked him this question: "Are you the Son of God?" Then even after Jesus answered in the affirmative, they condemned the Son of God to death. How many people could be saved from wrongful condemnation in our own courts of law if we simply acknowledged this truth? Like Jesus, we are all sons and daughters of God. At some point in our lives, most of us have heard this proverb: when you point a finger at someone, there are 3 more pointing back at you. Take a look at the picture for Station 3. Notice all the fingers. Who are they pointing at? Are they your fingers? Have you ever said something untrue or unkind about a person just because they weren't like you? What would you do if you heard someone say something untrue or unkind about your friend? When have you been guilty of condemning someone based on false externals? Have you ever hid behind the veneer of your own religious beliefs in an attempt to justify your prejudice? Meditate on Station 3, condemnation. Let's move to Station 4, which is called denial. Jesus is denied by Peter. I'll be reading from Matthew chapter 26, verses 69 through 75. Meanwhile, Peter sat outside in the courtyard. One of the servant girls came up to him. "You were with Jesus the Galilean too, weren't you?" she said. He denied it in front of everyone. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. He went out to the gateway. Another girl saw him and said to the people who were there, "This fellow was with Jesus the Nazarene." Once more he denied it, this time swearing, "I don't know the man." After a little while, the people standing around came up and said to Peter, "You really are one of them. Look, the way you talk makes it obvious." Then he began to curse and swear, "I don't know the man." And then all at once the cock crowed. And Peter remembered. He remembered the words Jesus had spoken to him: "Before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times." And he went outside and cried like a baby. It is not always easy to be true to our religious convictions when forces from all sides are asking us to deny the very things that give us life. Peter found this out in the courtyard as he watched Jesus being led away to trial. Just weeks before, Peter had mustered up the courage to profess that Jesus was the Messiah, the Son of the living God. But now, when questioned, he denied he even knew his friend and Savior. Who knows what would have happened if Peter had the courage of his convictions at that moment? Would the questioning servant girl have come to believe in Jesus? Would Peter's testimony have been able to save Jesus from death? Take a look at the picture for Station 4. Is the person with folded arms a defiant Peter? Or could it be a defiant Jesus saying to us, "No matter how many times you deny me, I will always love you"? Do you think there is anything you could do that would make Jesus stop loving you? Has there ever been a time that you have denied your faith or your belief in Jesus in order to fit in? Was it worth it? Have you ever experienced God's forgiveness after thinking you had done something that was unforgivable? Meditate on Station 4, denial. Let's move to Station 5, called judgment. Jesus is judged by Pilate. I'll be reading from Mark chapter 15, verses 1 through 5 and verse 15. As soon as morning came, the chief priests held a council meeting with the elders, the legal experts, and the whole Sanhedrin. They bound Jesus, took him off to Pilate, and handed him over. "Are you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate. "You have said it," replied Jesus. The chief priests laid many accusations against him. Pilate again interrogated him. "Aren't you going to make any reply? Look how many things they're accusing you of." But Jesus gave no reply at all, which astonished Pilate. Pilate wanted to satisfy the crowd, so he released Barabbas for them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. At this 5th station, we find ourselves standing with Jesus in Pilate's judgment hall. He is tired and dirty from a sleepless night, humiliated by the spitting and hurting from the slaps of those who wish to mock him. His clothes are ragged and torn, and he is hungry. Then the chief priests accused him of many things. Most of us have probably encountered someone on a street corner or a bus stop or the train platform holding their hand out, asking for assistance of some kind. Many of the people we encounter in these situations look tired and dirty and hungry, and we began to judge. And in our judgment of them, we found we had no time to love them. After the chief priests judged Jesus, Pilate handed him over to be crucified. Sadly, this is also what happens when we judge others rather than loving them. Our judgment condemns them to the death of hopelessness. Take a look at the picture for Station 5. Notice all the fingers pointing in judgment. What if instead they were all extended with a handshake of solidarity for the person judged wrongly? Fingers pointed in judgment will never find time to love. Have you ever thought less of someone because they didn't have nice clothes or a beautiful house? How do you think it would feel to be that person? How might you focus more on loving others than judging them? What concrete actions could you take to love someone whom others think is unlovable? Meditate on Station 5. Now let's turn to Station 6, called the crowning. Jesus is scourged and crowned with thorns. I'll be reading from John chapter 19, verses 1 through 3. So Pilate then took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers wove a crown of thorns, put it on his head, and dressed him up in a purple robe. Then they came up to him and said, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they slapped him. At this sixth station, we see the agents of the state forcing Jesus to wear a crown of thorns and a purple robe to identify him as the King of the Jews. The phrase "the Jews" is sprinkled liberally throughout John's account of the Passion, and unfortunately, Christians have often used this as an excuse for anti-Semitism and mistreatment of our Jewish brothers and sisters. Many biblical scholars believe that a more accurate translation of the Greek word Iudaioi would be Judeans, referring to a region, rather than Jews, referring to an entire religion. When it comes to religion and how we treat one another, words do matter. Whether Jesus lived in 1st century Jerusalem or 20th century Germany, he will always be found with the marginalized, the oppressed, and the forgotten. Take a look at the picture for Station 6. Notice the triangle in the middle. It seems to have broken pieces of glass or rock strewn on it. As you meditate on these shapes, be mindful of all the lives that have been broken over the centuries because of religious prejudice and the careless misuse of language. How do you think Jesus wants you to treat people of different religions? What could you do to learn something about the Jewish religion? Is it strange to think of Jesus as a Jew rather than a Christian? What implications might that have for your own relationships with people of other faiths? Let's meditate on Station 6, crowning. Let's now move to Station 7, called bearing. Jesus bears the cross. I'll be reading from John chapter 19, verse 6 and 15 through 17. So when the chief priests and their attendants saw him, they gave a great shout. "Crucify him," they yelled. "Crucify him." "Take him yourselves and crucify him," said Pilate. "I find him not guilty." "Take him away," they shouted. "Take him away. Crucify him." "Do you want me to crucify your king?" asked Pilate. "We have no king," the chief priests replied, "except Caesar." Then they handed him over to be crucified. So they took Jesus away. He carried his own cross and went to the spot called Skull Place, in Hebrew, Golgotha. The seventh station seems to be a very lonely one. John puts it this way: "And carrying the cross by himself, Jesus went out." Christians have argued for centuries over whether or not Jesus had to die. We have debated about the meaning of his death, and we have disagreed about its consequences. But what we do agree on is that somehow his solitary decision to take up the cross changed the course of history and had eternal consequences for all humanity. The Orthodox tradition has long held that Adam and Eve has been waiting for centuries in their graves for the coming of the one who would rescue them from sin and death. And perhaps as Jesus dragged his cross through the city streets that day, it began to rip apart the hardened earth where Adam and Eve lay waiting for resurrection. And perhaps Jesus' decision to carry his cross right into the face of death that day is what inspires people to walk in the face of danger to save others. Take a look at the picture for Station 7. Jesus appears to be carrying his cross resolutely, with precision, to the place of salvation. There is no hesitation. He's not looking back, because he knows that his lonely decision will save humanity and inspire countless others to selfless acts of sacrifice. When have you been asked to do something for someone else that you thought was really difficult? What gave you the strength to do it? What do you think about Jesus' decision to carry the cross as having cosmic consequences? How does Jesus' decision to carry the cross inspire you to engage in acts of selfless love for others? Let's meditate on Station 7. As we approach Station 8, it's called the helping. Jesus is helped by Simon the Cyrenian to carry the cross. I'll be reading from Mark chapter 15, verse 21. They compelled a man called Simon to carry Jesus' cross. He was from Cyrene and was coming in from out of town. He was the father of Alexander and Rufus. At this eighth station, we encounter Simon of Cyrene, the man from whom the soldiers forced to help carry Jesus' heavy cross. Coming in from the country was Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus. We don't know much about Alexander and Rufus. We don't know if they were children on the day of Jesus' journey to the cross, but imagine if they were. One tradition says they went on to become missionaries in the early Christian church. Some have even suggested that Rufus, mentioned by Paul in his letter to Rome, is Rufus, the son of Simon the Cyrene. Whatever the case, what we do know is that Rufus and his brother Alexander saw their father give a helping hand that day to someone in need, and that someone in need just happened to be the Son of God. We should never underestimate the power of our own example in the lives of children. Whether we have children of our own, nephews and nieces, godchildren, or children of friends, they all look to us for examples of how to be kind and helpful to people most in need. Ralph Waldo Emerson once wrote that the purpose of life is not to be happy, it is to be useful, to be honorable, to be compassionate, to have it make some difference that you have lived and lived well. Alexander and Rufus learned these traits from Simon. Take a look at the picture for Station 8 and notice all the lines that intersect. Imagine all the lives that have intersected with yours over the years because of your kindness. Maybe you can make a list just to see the impact that you've made. How have you set an example of kindness for others, especially children, in your life? How would it change the way you helped people if every time you extended a helping hand to someone, you imagined that they were Jesus? Meditate on Station 8. We approach Station 9, called Blessing. Jesus meets the women of Jerusalem. I'll be reading from Luke chapter 23, verses 27 through 31. A great crowd of the people followed Jesus, including women who were mourning and wailing for him. Jesus turned and spoke to them. "Daughters of Jerusalem," he said, "don't cry for me, cry for yourselves instead. Cry for your children. Listen, the time is coming when you will say, 'A blessing on the barren, a blessing on wombs that never bore children, and breasts that never nursed them.' At that time, people will start to say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' Yes, if this is what they do with the green tree, what will happen to the dry one?" At this 9th station, Jesus encounters the women of Jerusalem, and we hear strange words. "Blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore." Exactly the opposite of what we hear at the beginning of Luke's gospel when Gabriel announces to Mary that she will give birth to Jesus. "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb." Perhaps the words in Luke's account of the Passion are a reminder to us that every moment of our lives, even those places that seem to the most forsaken, especially those places, can we be places of God's blessing And it is precisely those most human of conditions that Jesus wishes to bless, to transform, and to take up into the divine life. Take another look at the picture in Station 9. It looks as if Jesus's hand is covered in bandages. We are most effective as agents of blessing to others when we have been wounded ourselves. Our own hurt makes us more empathetic to the pain of others. Hold your hand up, positioning like the hand in the picture. Who needs your blessing today? How can the pain you have experienced in your own life be a source of blessing for others? Let's meditate upon Station 9. Let's approach Station 10 now, crucifixion. Jesus is the crucified. Luke 23, 33 and 34. When they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified him there with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. Father, said Jesus, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. They divided his clothes, casting lots for them. Take a look at the picture for Station 10. On each crossbeam of the cross, it appears that ladders are descending and ascending. What makes the crucifixion so revolutionary is the truth that God, in the person of Jesus, descended to humanity, took on all the sufferings of the world, and died for the salvation of all people, so that we might ascend to the heights for which we were created. The vertical beam, plunged into the dark earth, also reaches up to the highest heaven, spanning the gulf between God and humanity. And the horizontal beam reaches from the criminal on Jesus' right to the criminal on his left, spanning the distance between alienated brothers and sisters. The mercy extended by Jesus at Calvary was the mercy we should extend to all people. And he knew that suffering and oppression will not last forever, because all has been redeemed through the life and death of Jesus. Could you imagine a time when you might use the image of the cross as a sign of protest against oppression? The Christmas carol, What Child Is This?, contains these lines: nails, spear shall pierce him through, the cross be borne for me, for you. Is it odd for you to think of the cross and the manger together? Let's meditate on Station 10. Let's move to Station 11, called Promise. Jesus promises his kingdom to the good thief. Luke 23, 39 through 43. One of the bad characters who was hanging there began to insult him. "Aren't you the Messiah?" he said. "Rescue yourself and us too." But the other one told him off. "Don't you fear God," he said. "You're sharing the same fate that he is. In our case, it's fair enough. We're getting exactly what we asked for. But this fellow hasn't done anything out of order." "Jesus," he went on, "remember when you finally become king." "I'm telling you the truth," replied Jesus. "You'll be with me in paradise this very day." As he hung on the cross dying, Jesus promised the thief next to him, "Today you will be with me in paradise." This word that Jesus uses, a Persian word referring to a park or a garden, only appears 2 other times in the scriptures. Paul uses it in 2 Corinthians when speaking of a vision he had. And John uses it in the book of Revelation to describe the life that awaits those who have been faithful. It says, "To everyone who conquers, I will give permission to eat from the tree of life that is in the paradise of God." Jesus' words in Revelation are clearly an echo back to the tree of life in the Garden of Eden. The promise of Jesus is that, in the end, all things will be restored to their perfect state, paradise. Take a look at the picture for station 11. A garden of flowers appears to be emerging from the base of the cross. Paradise seems to be starting to bloom. The message of this 11th station is that for those who place their trust in Jesus, paradise begins to blossom right here, right now. There is a creative cycle in the paradise of life. Sometimes things are blooming all around us. Sometimes beauty is lying dormant for a while underneath a frozen earth, and sometimes things must wither and die in order to be renewed and reborn. This is all part of the life of paradise. But the promise of Jesus to the thief and to us is that today you can live with him there. Jesus promised the criminal that today he will be with him in paradise. What do you think about the idea that paradise begins here and now? How might it change the way you practice your Christian faith to believe that we do not have to wait until we die to live in paradise with Jesus? Let's meditate on station 11. Let's move to station 12, called Care. Jesus speaks to his mother and the disciples. I'll be reading from John chapter 19, verses 25 through 27. Jesus' mother was standing beside his cross. So was her sister Mary, the wife of Clopas, with Mary Magdalene too. Jesus saw his mother and the disciple he specially loved standing there. "Mother," he said, "look, there's your son." Then he spoke to the disciple. "Look," he said, "there's your mother." From that time, the disciple welcomed her into his own home. At this 12th station, Jesus, now in his last moments of life, concerns himself not with his own suffering, but with the suffering of his mother and one of his best friends who were gathered at the foot of the cross. Mary, his mother, was most likely a widow at this point in her life. Now, with the death of her eldest son, she would be relegated to the lowest rungs of society with no one to look after her. So Jesus motioned to John, the beloved disciple, and asked him to take Mary into his own care. "Behold your mother." And then he asked Mary to look after John as if he were her own son. "Behold your son." There at the cross, Jesus asked his followers to be reckless in their concern and care for one another. He asked them to strip away the traditional ideas of what constituted a family and to forge a new family of faith that would care for one another at all costs. Tertullian, an early Christian leader, once said that when the Romans saw Christians in action, they would exclaim, "See how they love one another?" As Christianity spread, so did love. They went on to establish some of the first hospitals in the world, buried the dead with dignity, treated all people with care and respect. Take a look at the picture for station 12. The beloved disciple's arm is lovingly placed around Mary's shoulder. As you spend time thinking about this picture, who is in need of your care at the moment? When have you been, quote, reckless, end quote, in your care for another person? How might your relationships with people in your congregation or community change if you thought of them as family? Meditate on station 12. Let's move to station 13, called Darkness. Jesus dies on the cross. I'll be reading from Luke chapter 23, verses 44 through 46. By the time of the 6th hour, darkness came over all the land. The sunlight vanished until the 9th hour. The veil of the temple was ripped down the middle. Then Jesus shouted out at the top of his voice, "Here's my spirit, Father. You can take care of it now." And with that, he died. At this station, we arrive at the end of Luke's gospel. All hope that God's sunrise will appear seems to be lost. Darkness comes over the land, and the sun's light fails. But then an amazing event happens in the midst of this darkness. The veil in the temple is torn in two. The false wall that had been erected between God and humanity comes crushing down at the death of Jesus. Take a look at the picture for Station 13. Notice that you are looking from behind the veil to the cross. It's as if we were always on the inside, just waiting for God's sunrise to break upon us. As you reflect on the images on the veil, be mindful of those who still sit in darkness, in the shadow of death. How might you rip the veil open for them? Can you think of a time when you might have been sitting in darkness? How is God challenging you to bring God's light to other people who are sitting in darkness? Let's meditate on Station 13. Let's move on to Station 14, called Burial. Jesus is placed in the tomb. This is the last station for Good Friday. I'll be reading from Matthew chapter 27, verses 57 through 60. When evening came, a rich man from Arimathea arrived. He was called Joseph, and he too was a disciple of Jesus. He went to Pilate and requested the body of Jesus. Pilate gave the order that it should be given to him. So Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a clean linen cloth. He laid it in his own new tomb, which he had carved out of the rock. Then he rolled a large stone across the doorway of the tomb and went away. At this 14th station, we see Joseph of Arimathea, a person of great wealth and merciful compassion. Mary was the widow of a poor carpenter, and Jesus was an itinerant rabbi. In the eyes of many, they were just poor peasants. In the eyes of the state, Jesus was a criminal unworthy of a proper burial. But to Joseph, a secret follower of Jesus, Jesus was the very image of God, and as such, he deserved a respectful burial. Take a look at the picture for Station 14. Out of the front of the stone, there appears to be a seed hanging from the branch of a tree. Around the seed, it looks like things are beginning to emerge and grow. As followers of Jesus, the seed of resurrection life has already been planted in our hearts. And on the day of our own burial, the seed will begin to sprout as we make our way back home to God, in whose image we were created. Take a closer look at the picture. Perhaps what looks like a seed is also a cocoon. At first glance, a cocoon doesn't seem to be a likely image for Easter, but it's what's going on inside that counts. The old caterpillar is being transformed into a beautiful butterfly that will emerge bright with color and full of new life. As you finish meditating on this station, think about how your own life has been transformed by taking this journey with Jesus. When you've been at the cemetery, how did it make you feel to be around the graves? Have you ever seen a butterfly come out of its cocoon? Why do you think the butterfly is one of the symbols people use at Easter? How does your own tradition give respect to the body after death? What do the funeral rituals of your church teach about the dignity of the human body? Let's close by meditating on Station 14 and then hearing our closing song by Hannah.
Above all powers, above all